Arliss Clark, welcome to the Artist Empire. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, David. Appreciate you for having me. I'm a new big fan, and yeah, I'm excited to talk with you.
Well, just to give audiences a little bit of context as to how we came together to have this conversation, you had reached out to me emailing about the James Zimmerman episode and wanted to come on and provide a sort of alternative, not necessarily on James and his case, but on the concept of orchestra culture, on the topic of DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is obviously a very big topic. We're going to talk a little bit about your career, your experience within the orchestra. But before we get into any of that, if you wouldn't mind not only introducing yourself, but telling audiences a little bit about what it is that you do, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to talk about all those things, and I think that they're all sort of connected, you know. But for everybody who doesn't know me, my name is Carlos Clark. I am a bassoonist from Metro Detroit, Michigan. Right now, I'm in my last season as a fellow with the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. And that's been a great experience, and it's taught me a lot, specifically about, right now I'm thinking about where am I going to go after this, which is terrifying. Thinking about, okay, well, I should probably get a few dentist appointments before those benefits fall out. I should probably get some new glasses. But yeah, it's easy for me to say that I'm a bassoonist. I think that's my primary job, and that's my expertise. That's what I went to school for. I went to school at Central Michigan University. I played football first. I was a D1 football player at Central Michigan University, starting from 2015 to 2017, 18. And then I decided to go back. Once I quit that, I decided I didn't like my biomed courses or degree. I don't know why I picked that. I just liked biology in high school. I thought it was interesting. And so I didn't know what to do. So I picked up this old Schreiber bassoon that I had, and I went and auditioned, informal audition. I went and played for the teacher at Central Michigan University. Her name is MaryBeth Minnis, and I owe her a ton. She changed my life. But when it comes to what I do or what I want to do, I think that you and I have a lot in common. And this is why I think, or I don't know how much of it in common, but I think I agree with your philosophy, your musical philosophy, a lot when it comes to objectivity or music needing to be objective, in that it's capable of having real world consequences. That's what I believe. And I think that as we continue on this path, whatever this path is called or wherever it's headed, I think that the orchestra is something that's going to emerge as an institution that people rely on. And I want to be a part of that. And so I think that and more so than just playing my instrument as a bassoonist, I love doing that, but I think I want to be an artistic director or planner. I think that's my next thing. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, and you also were the principal bassoonist at the Atlanta Opera, which I was especially interested in because that's right in my backyard.
Right. Yeah. When I found out that you were teaching at Georgia State, I was like, yeah, I've been there, and I know some people, and I'm kind of upset that we didn't know each other, especially like watching all your videos in preparation of coming and talking to you. I was like, oh, I think we would have had some good conversations. But yeah, I think the Atlanta Opera job was momentous. I'm going to say this about a lot of things because hopefully we get into, like my overall career, especially when it comes from football and the culture shock that I had going into the orchestra, or that culture, or even just music school, honestly. If I didn't win that job in the Atlanta Opera, I'm not sure I would be the musician I am today. And I think what the Atlanta Opera did for me in working there was it taught me that this is something to fight for. And especially through my colleagues.
And when you say this is worth something to fight for, what is this?
There's a lot of ways to say that, but the product. I think when it comes to people, when I went to DePaul, I went to DePaul University for my master's, and I started in 20. I won the Atlanta Opera job in the summer of 22, and that was after my first year in DePaul. So I started the 2021, fall of 2021. I went to DePaul, and that's in downtown Chicago. And I remember the first time I went there was the first time as an adult that I went to Chicago, and it was the first time that I drove into it myself. And I remember going there's a toll road called the Skyway into Chicago. For anybody who's ever coming in from the east into Chicago, you can do the toll bridge, and when you go up, it takes you all over the southeastern south neighborhoods, and then you can see the skyline. And it was the first. I come from a small city in Michigan called Belleville. I know I said Metro Detroit, but Belleville, Michigan is where I'm raised. And it's a very small suburb. And I wouldn't say it's diverse, but when it comes to black and white, it felt about 50-50. And also, economic disparities weren't so apparent because it's small, and then there wasn't that many out there. So I grew up poor, and I knew I had rich friends, but I didn't quite understand the levels that people were living next to each other in, and how incredible they were in difference, until I drove into Chicago. And when I drove a couple days after being in Chicago, I remember, and the reason I went to DePaul was because the three teachers at DePaul are all three bassoonists of the Chicago Symphony. And I'm like, this has to be the place I go, because I'm going to learn from the best. And so I'm keeping up with what they're doing, because I always want to know what they're doing, because you have to study from the best, but also the institution that they work for. And I remember this was coming out of COVID, and this is the first season coming out of COVID, and Maestro Riccardo Muti I think this is his last, he opened the concert with Beethoven 6. And the way that he addressed the audience, and I read this through the newspaper article, was pretty much summed up as, you guys are all back here and you returned because you need Beethoven. And I remember hearing that, and I filled with anger, because how could you say that? Like, how could you say that the city of Chicago needed Beethoven when these people are living over here like this, and what is Beethoven helping for these people? And so that was where my head was for a long time, and I never really understood what classical music can do for somebody, or even beyond that. Going into the opera, I thought, what can opera do? I mean, like, if like a Beethoven symphony is kind of difficult, like, what can that do? It seems like opera's even a level above that in fanciness, or in class. And so I remember going into it like that, and not really caring about opera. And then once I got there, and to put it in some context, I dropped out of school, and I still stayed in Chicago, but I drove back and forth. It's a part-time orchestra or part-time opera company, even though they're top 10 in budget-wise, which is, we can whatever. But I would stay with one of two people. It would either be Debbie Grove, who is the second bassoonist of the Atlanta Opera, and she was really important for me in my development for those couple of years, because she gave me a place to stay like I was family. And she told me this after I won the audition. So after I won the audition, and then I went and talked to the panel in front of everybody, she said, if you need a place to stay, you can stay with me. And she didn't even know me. And so that was the first time in a professional setting where I wasn't attached to my teacher in any way, that somebody really went and grabbed me and said, I'll help you. And so I accepted that. And then also Christina Gavin is the principal oboist of the opera orchestra. She also did the same thing for me too. So when I was there, I didn't have to work other than I'm practicing my bassoon and making sure that I showed up at work right. And so I have a lot of time to think. I had maybe a little bit too much time to think, because you can only play the bassoon and make reeds for so long. And anybody who makes reeds understands that, especially oboists. Me and Christina would always, anyway. But so I had only a couple options, to fill my time. Either I practice or go explore Atlanta, or just hang out, or I could really try to figure out what Riccardo Muti meant by you came out here because you needed this. And so a couple pieces, my primary goal of being a principal bassoonist in the orchestra, the way that I was trying to execute it was the only way for me to make whatever's on stage to be the thing that people are focused on and really understand is if whenever I'm a part of the sound, the only way I can really do my job is if I understand what's happening in the plot and the story. So that way I can, really try be a part of the immersion, the experience for this audience. And so when you do that, you have to really look at what the story is. And once I started looking at the story of Candide, the story of Rigoletto especially is one that changed my life. And we brought up James Zimmerman, and I think, I don't know how else to say it. I think about James when I think about Rigoletto. And I think about this, and we can talk more about that in a second, but what I'm trying to say is that this music that is mostly excluded, and I'm gonna bring up my identity multiple times through this. I've walked through the world as a Black man because that's usually what people see me as, and I've benefited a lot. I'm partly here because I am Black, because of DEI, whatever, pity. I don't really care, but I'm biracial, so I don't want anybody to see this and be like, oh, he's speaking for the whole Black people. I don't want anybody to get that. I don't want anybody to think that I'm trying to do that. I'm just speaking of my experience. But yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is opera is still here, and it's because it's really good, not only because it's good and it looks good or it sounds good, but because it deals with the human experience. And so I think and what opera taught me because of that is that these stories that were happening hundreds of years ago, not only are they happening now, but they apply to me as somebody who's playing in the pit. And so that really blew my mind and changed my life and really changed how I started looking at things. So that's what I meant by my belief in the product. I think that opera is a tool for everybody, or it should be for everybody. So yeah.
We'll jump into DEI in a moment, but on that comments, you're here because you need Beethoven. I think that that's true in a sense. One of the things, and it's a natural reaction, I understand, well, I have a lot of economic poverty. I'm in a place where things are rough. Beethoven doesn't put food on the table, in other
Right,
words.
right. Yeah.
I would perhaps expand on this definition of poverty and say that it seems that there are multiple types of poverty that one can be in. Economic is obviously an
Mm.
immediate one, material poverty. There's relational poverty. There is poverty of the, if you'll permit me to use this term, poverty of the soul. One of the things that music, not just music, but great music can do is that, how do I say this? It serves a human function. It doesn't serve a utilitarian function. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
So it's
right,
true
right.
that, yes, Beethoven doesn't put food on the table, granted. But Beethoven does do something for that immaterial part of you, that immaterial part of the soul, which is just as important to be nourished. I think that's perhaps a more charitable interpretation of what your maestro said in that moment.
Yeah, you know what? I do think that that's what he meant, but see, I really do like your content a lot, specifically because of the video that you put out, titled "My Musical Philosophy,"
Hmm.
because you wanted to make sure that you responded to the comments and not be like, I'm platforming these people, but this is not exactly what I think. This is what I think, and I really appreciate content like that. Um, I don't think I agree with that.
Tell me why.
I I think that, um, right now I'm working on a project, and it's sort of like a lecture recital. It's also why I like you, because you talked about your lecture recital. I also use that as a way to try and really send a message. Whatever, I love doing that. I love talking, playing. That's a great format. I also think it's the future of the orchestra, but we can get into that later. Um, but right now, I'm trying to tie a connection between Bach and Francisco Mignone, who was, a Brazilian composer. He was born in 1897 and he died in 1980 something. And I'm trying to make a story out of it. And what it's going to do is going to go from, it's going to play a piece from Bach, and then Mozart, Weber, and then the first act is going to end with Wagner. And what it's going to do between all those works is kind of describe, through a story, because I don't want to lecture people and be like, 1722, Germany was cut up into 17 different things in Holy Roman Empire. I'm going to put it into a narrative so people can, not think about the real world implications in that moment, so they can enjoy it. But when I try and humanize Wagner, which is, a composer that I could talk a lot about, the things that he said that I think are gross and ignorant, just frankly. Um, and that's one of the things that the Atlanta Opera was trying to do. Was I said we were gonna be playing the Ring Cycle. This is a perfect time to talk about anti-Semitism. It's a perfect time because we want to take this music and act like it's for everybody. One, I don't see everybody in here, and second of all, he didn't say that. I'm cool with using it, but we should talk about it. That's one of the things that I was. It was a short conflict. It didn't really go anywhere, but that was one of the things I was thinking about, after I got tenure and got a little voice, a little deepness in my voice got after once I got tenure, in Atlanta. Um, but what I want to show people through the music of Bach, Mozart, Weber, and then into Wagner is like what was happening when Bach wrote this, what was happening when Mozart wrote this, what was happening when Weber wrote this, and where does Wagner find himself, and what has he been listening, and what has he been hearing from the people before him. And what I'm trying to do is humanize him to show that, he didn't just come out of nowhere. He ended up here because of what happened to him. And um and I'm no scholar or academic, especially when it comes to like German politics, but like I know that Hitler loved Wagner. We all know that. We all know that he used him. I don't want to say used him, but he definitely had an affinity with him, and he even said that he learned from the mistakes of Wagner's operas, whatever. And he had a through those lessons and through that his perspective of history that I perceive is that the music of Bach eventually um, ends up manifesting itself physically in the way that this person who has this power or this vision or this motivation to do something about their lived experience. And so when I think about like music not being a utilitarian function, it's like it's kind of hard for me to be like, yeah, it just does something to us. But I feel like, well, I mean, maybe that is true. Like indirectly, it's not a utilitarian function, but I know that art does something to people, and then people do things about how they feel. You know. So what do you think about that? This is something I wanted to ask you.
I guess when I say utilitarian, I mean in the merely material sense. So it doesn't
Yeah.
nourish me like a cheeseburger would, as a kind of a dumb example. But it nourishes me in
Right.
the
Yeah.
sense that it connects me with something beyond myself that is not a merely material function. I'm not a materialist
Yeah.
in this sense. I
Okay.
think music is deeply immaterial and deeply um, necessary for the soul, as is great art. I mean, this is why I've had conversations about architecture and painting and
Mhm.
sculptures and essentially any art form that I can get my hands on that I think has a transcendent nature, a transcendent value. That these things are not merely material in their essence. They have a material aspect, but their function is not meant to be material. And most utilitarians that approach this subject approach it from a merely material, if I can't see it, if I can't touch it, then ultimately it's not real. And I think that this is an incorrect approach to art in general.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it. Yeah, I think it does. And I think I would also agree with that. Um, and I guess just to build off of that, I feel like let me ask you another question,
Hmm.
if you will allow me. When you did your lecture recital, remind us of the title one more time.
Yes, so the lecture recital, for those who don't know, when I graduated with my master's degree, I did
Yeah.
a lecture recital titled The Postmodern Conundrum: Why Art Needs Objectivity. And I opened the lecture recital with a performance of John Cage's infamous 1950s piece, 433.
Hmm. And um, can you tell me what was the moment that you decided you needed to do this, or that you were like, what was the motivation?
Well, I've been in school now since I was 16. I'm 27. I started community college actually full time when I was 16 to 18 at Delmar College, and then I did 4 years at North Texas, and then 2 years at Columbus State. Um, During my time as a music student, I encountered a lot of compositions by students who were working in these music departments that were just generally awful. They were generally atonal, which I think in and of itself is an oxymoronic term. They were generally poorly written, and the performances themselves were awful. And yet nobody seemed to want to call out this work as being awful. And if you compared it to
Yeah.
something that had a beautiful, transcendent nature to the composition, people chafed at that. And I didn't understand why that was until up into my master's degree. I suppose I also developed a little bit more of a spine and finally decided to say, no, this is ridiculous. Somebody needs to say that this emperor is wearing no clothes. I'm just going to demonstrate it with my work.
which is which is something that you, me, and James Zimmerman have in common. I just want to make that clear. That like, yeah, and I guess that's what I mean by like, there's no utilitarian function. Yeah, I guess in the moment it doesn't do anything, but I feel like it's so hard for me to disconnect that motivation and feeling like I need to do something or say something because something is wrong or somebody needs my help or I'm being done wrong, and then creating art that shows that. Or even, I think, doing a lecture recital or being a teaching artist is like the goal of that for me is to physically manifest in this audience what I think the composers were really trying to get at, you know? And so I and the reason why I asked like why did you do that is because I feel like music is a way to really understand why people do things.
Yes, the definition
Yeah.
I use for music, it's not an all-encompassing definition, so I'll caveat it with that. But the definition that I use for music is the manifestation of abstract ideas that words and images alone cannot fully realize. So it's what makes
Mm.
music distinct from all other art forms. This is another way of separating it from just noise music, or I would say non-music music, atonal music, oxymoronic music.
Yeah.
This is the definition of music that I use when going in and trying to explain to people what it is that we do. And I agree with you. There's obviously a material, how would you say, a material consequence for music. Obviously, music is tied to certain places and certain times, but there's also an element of music that makes it transcendent, particularly great music. It's true. Bach is writing for a very specific people and a very specific time and a very specific place. And yet, this music has survived for hundreds of years and can be enjoyed by literally anybody across the world today. And this is also why I chafe at
Yeah.
this idea that music is not a universal language. I do believe that music has a how would I say this? Music has a universal nature to it. It's not the exact same language across culture, but there are certain characteristics that exist within each culture, within each form of music that have the
Yeah.
ability to transcend its time and place.
Yeah. I think, yeah, I think I agree with that too. And then especially I feel like why Bach is so good or other people, I think my favorite composer is Heitor Villa-Lobos. And I think this is true about many good composers is that it feels like when they write something, it can be played on anywhere at any time too. You know what I mean? It's not just specific to like this. Like we can play Bach on any instrument. We can play or any. We can make up what we have with what they've given us, regardless if we have an orchestra. You know what I mean? I think like all the people who've done. I think even you have put on your channel Beethoven's Fifth, and it's a. I think it's a piano trio, isn't it?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, and so I think I definitely it's kind of going off topic, but I crave when I think about new music, I'm like I crave that. I crave something that can be transported and not something that's like only going to happen right here. You know, do you feel that way?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Again, just going back to it, music obviously has a transcendental nature. I like the idea, especially you mentioned the Beethoven Fifth arrangement. I like the idea of taking old music, overplayed, some might say, music, and arranging it for ensembles that perhaps people aren't as familiar with. I think that's a way
Yeah.
of bringing new life to old music as well, and that's a way that it can be revitalized. Now, we are
Yeah.
30 minutes in, and I do not want to let the subject of
Yes.
DEI
Sorry.
sit in the
Yep.
corner for too long. So I want to unpin
Okay.
that, bring that to the forefront. Tell me why, in your opinion, and maybe you disagree with this, but tell me why, in your opinion, DEI is a good thing to have in an orchestra.
I think DEI is something that's good because, well, see, yeah, it's hard for me because the idea of a place being diverse, inclusive, and equitable are all things that everybody should want.
Let me pause there just so I want to make sure that we're not talking at cross purposes. When you say
Yeah.
diverse and inclusive, can you tell people what it is that you mean by that?
When it comes to DEI, like when I think of all of the words um, that make up DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that that's something that people want, um, even if they don't agree with the way that uh, liberal policy has implemented DEI. I think, or at least I'd like to hope. So I think diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that's good, no matter where, because we live in a world where I brought up James Baldwin earlier, and he has this last. I'm going to read this, and he wrote this in 1967, I think. But this was his take on what it was like for him to reflect on America as a stranger in this Swedish village. He said, "The time has come to realize the interracial drama acted out on the American continent has not only created a new black man, it has created a new white man too. No road whatever will lead Americans back to the simplicity of this European village where white men still have the luxury of looking on me as a stranger. I am not really a stranger any longer for any American alive. One of the things that distinguishes Americans from other people is that no other people have ever been so deeply involved in the lives of black men and vice versa. This fact, faced with all its implications, it can be seen that the history of the American Negro problem is not merely shameful, it is something of an achievement. For even when the worst has been said, it must also be added that the perpetual challenge posed by this problem is always somehow perpetually met. It is precisely this black-white experience which may prove indispensable value to us in the world the issues that we face today in this world. This world is white no longer and will never be white again." And I think that's the whole point, is that DEI is important because we're not going back. I don't think that the world is going to go back to what it was before. I think it's about progress. And this is what I'm saying again, is like, I don't, the way that DEI has been implemented has been lazy. And I also think it's the reason why we have symptoms of this larger system, and that being an example, James Zimmerman.
Before we go any further, I do want to approach this almost from an abstract academic perspective. So, imagine I'm somebody from Hungary and I'm just now hearing about this. Let's go through each of these terms real quick. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So first off, in your view, what is diversity?
You're going to hate me. Can I please give you a long answer? I don't know how
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I play bassoon. This is what I play. And when you're a professional bassoonist, you make reeds. And there's a couple different, just like how there's different schools of playing, there are different schools of reed making. And the one big reed making school of thought is the Hertzberg school of bassoon reed making. And he's got his own shape. It all looks, what I mean by that is when you shape the cane, he has his own shape, and he did all of his process according to that shape. But the three main principles of the Hertzberg reed making process is response, intonation, and sound. Those three. And what he said was, these are not all equal things. There's an argument about what is more important, intonation or response. And a lot of people will say that intonation is important because the harmony is important, and you need to be able to, you can't sound good if you're not in tune. A lot of people like me will think, well, response is actually the most important, because how could you ever be in tune or sound good if you can't respond in time? Okay. But that all being said, intonation and response, if those things work together, then you will sound good. And that's just the most simplest way to understand that. I think diversity, equity, and inclusion has been looked at as in a different way than Hertzberg's three main principles. The way we look at it is diversity, equity, inclusion, when really all of those things can't really happen at the same time. And I think that the way that DEI has been implemented is like that, a superficial. Black people aren't coming to the orchestra because there are no black people on stage. Then we put black people on stage, and then there are still problems, right? And I think my experience is like my blackness, me being black has never been an issue, but what my blackness leads me to is an issue. But regardless, I think diversity is the goal, or is the thing that will happen.
Yeah, and forgive me,
Equity,
I don't mean to
yeah.
interrupt, but when you say diversity is the goal, it's the thing that needs to happen. What is that thing, diversity?
That thing is like it's a vision, you know. I think it's a vision, and it's something that's anything can be played, and in the context of the orchestra or uh, music school or whatever, is that any music can be played and anybody is welcome, and they're all able to understand it, and we're all able to go along in this same process and get the same things, and do it all together, no matter where we come from. And we're all able to provide what our backgrounds have given to the situation. You know, like people will say diversity of thought. I happen to agree with that. We need people who think differently, not just look differently. I think that's the truth. So yeah, does that clear that up?
I think so. Let me try and articulate it back to you, and you tell me
Yeah.
if this is a correct understanding. Orchestras need to be able to play essentially whatever it is that they want, so more of a diversity within the repertoire. Not everything has to be a Beethoven or Brahms cycle. Um, More diversity in terms of who can apply. We want to make sure that auditions are open to as many people as possible from as many backgrounds as possible. Would that be a fair characterization of what you said so far?
I I think so. I think, yeah. I'm sorry. I don't mean to give you a hard time with this.
No, no, no,
And
not at all.
I
I'm just trying to make sure I understand.
yeah. I think that that could be correct. I just think that, and I really meant by the Hertzberg principles, response, intonation, sound, is that we can't. Sound is subjective, right? And I think in this way, depending on what the context is, diversity is also subjective, right? Like diversity, through intonation and response, we get a good sound. Through being equitable and inclusive, we will be diverse. And when I think about being inclusive and equitable, that vision of diversity looks like a place where anybody can join and say anything and be welcomed, and all of those things. I have a dream. Today is Martin Luther King's birthday. He would have turned 97. That's what I think people mean by diversity, is that everybody's welcome. I have a hard time answering it any other way, I think. You know?
No, that's fine. Then
Yeah.
that's a nice segue into this next part. When you say equity, what is equity? That E in DEI, what is equity?
I think equity is probably, the way that I think about it is justice, reparations, not just like reparations for Black people, but reparations. What can we do when it comes to music and the orchestra and classical music? How can we make sure that these people are able to be here? How can we set and maybe this is the response connection, like how can we make sure that people even have the choice or the access to this thing? And I think that looks a whole bunch of different ways. Tell me, does that make sense?
Can you take the term equity and apply it to orchestra culture? How does equity apply to orchestra culture?
I think that being equitable in a orchestra culture could look a whole bunch of different ways. Like you're looking at like how can we provide transportation for kids to come in from who don't have the ability to, like how can we throw money at the problem? I think that's one way of looking at it. But also I think when it comes to interpreting the music, I think we should be equitable too. And I think when I spoke about my project and how the first act is going to be humanizing Wagner, I think looking at him and recognizing the things that I disagree with, and then also realizing what happened to him and explaining those things and not excluding the bad things that people also want to be brought up. That's being equitable. I think for me, if we're doing the ring cycle in the Atlanta Opera, what we should do is talk about Wagner's anti-Semitism as we profit in whatever different ways of putting on his ring cycle. Does that make sense?
I think I understand what you're saying. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I want to make sure we get at least the core definition out of the way before we start applying this to more orchestral work. Inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is the I in inclusion?
It's the ability to, well, man, I feel like I'll just give like the same response, but I feel like inclusion is the want to understand people and to bring them in, and how can we bring them in? And I think that might be the number one critique I have of like and also maybe I should have put this, earlier. I'm not an official DEI representative. I'm not somebody who gets paid to do DEI policy. I'm a Black classical musician who's watching and observing. And so I'm definitely, like I keep saying, I'm not the spokesperson for this, but I think inclusivity is the ability for the people who have control of this thing to notice they don't feel included in this. How can I make sure that they do? I think when I think about inclusion, I think about like an action, and much less than like, I know you said you wanted to be academic, and I'm sorry, I'm no academic, but
no worries. When I say academic, I mean try and my goal here is attempt to first understand what we mean when we say DEI, and then I want to see how this applies to an orchestra, and then I want to see how that fits and if there's any contradictions. So far,
I see.
I think I can at least come halfway on a lot of these issues. I like it when orchestras try new things. I think it's good to try new compositions and try and highlight new composers. I think that's a wonderful thing, and I'm all for that. I love it when my friends get their compositions performed. I think of somebody like Arsenty Haritonov, who's this unbelievable Russian pianist who writes a piano concerto and goes and performs it, and he writes a violin concerto, gets that debuted. I think that's exciting. That's great. Wonderful. So if we mean diversity in that sense, yay, 2 thumbs up. I think that this is awesome. On inclusion, I should say, I want as many people to come and enjoy this music as possible. I think that the doors should be open, and we should market to as many types of people as possible. I think that you should say that, we want anybody who plays these instruments to come in and audition, because if you're good, we want you in this orchestra. But that leads us to the E, equity. And this is, I think, where we're going to find some friction. And I want to get more of your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
Blind auditions. We don't care what you look like. We don't care if you're a male. We don't care if you're a female. We don't care if you're from Detroit. We don't care if you're from Russia. We don't care if you're from South Africa. We don't care if you're from Croatia. We just care about how it is that you sound. And the only thing that we're going to be looking at is that, or I should say, the only thing that we're going to be listening to is how you perform. And yes, there's going to be a process after you get hired. We want to make sure that you get along well in the orchestra. But fundamentally, we agree with you. We care about diversity, we care about inclusion, we care about bringing all of these people in, and we want to select from this pool the greatest players to be a part of our orchestra. Now, this seems to rub up against this idea of equity, because fundamentally, it's not going to be equal. Fundamentally, there is going to be discrimination based on sound. This person played more out of tune than this person has better musical skills than this person's able to follow instruction better than this person, and that's the only thing that we care about. That's where the definition of DEI seems to hit a wall with this idea of meritocracy, and I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's hard. It's hard for me to be like, okay, well, what's a different, if I were in administration and I had all the time in the world to do whatever, I would probably find a different way. But I understand that we live in this reality where to get away from discrimination and just focus on the product, we need to put a screen there and not see who it is until we decide we want this sound in the orchestra. I think that's fair, and I'm not sure how to be more equitable than that, because the screen kind of puts a number on people. It doesn't care about what you look like or what you like to talk about. I think that that's a good thing. I think the issue that I see is that the reason why that's not bringing that didn't just mean like, okay, now Black people are just winning and white people are still like dominant, even though like it's a numbers game. I don't know how to really go about that, but all I know is that music, especially classical music, is something that isn't accessible to everybody at the same rate, depending on who they are. And one way that I like to look at this is looking at somebody who's super privileged, who I also look up to a lot. And one of my teachers is Keith Buncke of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He, from my perspective, was somebody who had all the access, all the time, and the great environment, and parents who wanted him to do it and supported him, and he wanted it. He wanted it because he played the bassoon all day, and it shows. He can do whatever you want, and when he plays, he wins, and when he auditions, he wins. I don't know how else to say it. To win an audition is one of the hardest things in the world. Talking, and from my perspective, as somebody who played Division I football, I'm not saying that I was like the best or anything, but what you have to do to win an audition is, people all know this, you have to practice a lot, blah, 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 but you have to learn to live with yourself for this goal. And I think we have to think about this historically. When your material conditions are ones that don't give you the ability to do that, and if Black people historically have been people that, I mean, there's progress, sure. I'm not trying to say that we're, still like in Jim Crow times. I'm not trying to say that, but I think if orchestras want to be even more equitable, what they're going to have to do is go beyond just the audition. If you want more diversity, if you want to be more equitable to people, so that way there's a more diverse orchestra, what you'll have to do is go beyond before the audition and do your best to make sure that people have the ability to come and do this. And I think one of the ways that that orchestras and a lot of different organizations are really what they're doing their best at is like outreach. Or at the PSO, we do school time, and we bust kids out to come and do that. And that's one way of exposing them to this. But I think we can do more. I think we don't have to just be like, here's what it sounds like, and then be like, Why aren't black people showing up? You know what I mean? We have to make sure that they have it before they get to the audition, and we have to make sure that we do our best at making sure they have it materially, financially, economically, whatever, and then also that they understand what it is. I think that's yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, well, again, I think a lot of this I can come at least halfway on. In the
Yeah,
Columbus Symphony that I'm playing in right now, which is right next to the Schwab School of Music, they do something very similar that I've done quite a bit, which is the outreach programs. And it's not just
yeah,
busing kids in, but we would go out as smaller string ensembles and play in schools and introduce
yeah,
ourselves. These are our instruments. This is what we do. And it would be a wide variety of music. It wouldn't just be classical music as an attempt to help generate interest. I say, again, two thumbs up to that. Yay, let's do more of that. Let's be arts advocates.
yeah,
This goal of orchestras wanting to be diverse, I don't want to say whether, at least right now, whether that's a good or bad goal, but I would like to point out that it seems that we're in conflicting goals while also trying to make great music. It is an orchestra's job, and I'm asking this more as an open question just for the audience even to consider,
yeah.
is the orchestra's job to put on great performances, or is it to try and be more diverse? If you want to try and be more diverse, and that means bringing in players who don't necessarily have the chops to be able to play this great music, then it needs to be acknowledged that the orchestra is aiming for a, let's say, for lack of a better term, superficial, materialistic goal versus its goal to play great abstract music. Those two do seem to be in conflict. And then that last point, what was I going to say? Um, I'm sure it'll come to me. But what do you think about
Yeah.
those? At least those first two.
I yeah, and I think Mr. Zimmerman is an example of that conflict. You know what I mean? I just feel like there doesn't have to be a conflict. And I think that, and I don't think that you were saying this, but I just want to clear this up because I feel like a lot of people feel that what Mr. Zimmerman is saying is like black people are coming in and they don't sound as good, which I don't necessarily think that's happening, especially like at like a level like where he's at. I don't see when black people are getting hired, I don't see them being bad. I don't see them not being able to do the job. So I don't, if that's how he feels or if that's how people feel, I'm not sure how to really combat that as somebody who's in it and looks up to black players and understands that they're really good at their job. Andrew Brady, Titus Underwood, Rufus Olivier, he's one of the OGs. He's principal in the San Francisco Opera and Ballet. Um, so I think what has shown is that we're capable of doing that. I think that, sorry, remind me of the conflict.
Yes, so an ideological conflict. If I'm prioritizing hiring diverse players over hiring the best players,
Yeah,
if they happen to be diverse, great. But if I'm prioritizing diversity over great music, then I have now a conflict of interest. I can either have, the greatest players, or I can have an orchestra that fits a diversity quota. And if you can make the two
right.
work, then hey, like I'm not going to say anything. I think that's a wonderful thing. But if you're
Yeah,
sacrificing one on the altar of the other, now we have a problem.
right. And I think maybe the way that it's set up now is there's a conflict, but I think that there's something missing, and I think that's the players. Because my experience with orchestra culture, and I don't mean when I say this, I don't want to make people feel like I look at my colleagues and say, you know, you have a super privileged life having a 120 plus dollar contract. You don't have to worry about this, and um, you have enough time and resources to help out in other ways. I think that, and the reason why I want to be a player in an orchestra, and the same reason why Mr. Zimmerman does too, that he said, is because it grants you a lifestyle of leisure. It gives you time to think and to do the things that you want to do. And it makes me upset that when and not saying that nobody does it, but I just think that it can be more effective, is that when you have a lot of time, what do you want to do with your time, and where is it all going to? And the orchestra it's made up of 80 full-time people. That's a lot of people that can do a lot of that can have a big impact, other than just playing as greatly and doing their job, doing their primary job of showing up and being in tune and in time and sounding beautiful. We have to do more than that. And I think that there's a way to do both of those things. But I okay, let me take it another. I think the conflict is that we don't know what we're playing. I think that's the root problem of the orchestra, and why there is this conflict, this DEI conflict of meritocracy and identity. I think is because we don't know the things that we're actually producing for our community, and the way that it could be better related to them, if that makes sense. And the only way to do that, I feel like, is to do more than just show up and be in time and in tune. I think you have to understand what the music is saying and how that relates to people who aren't in the building. And what can I do with that? Or how can I get that to work? And the players aren't the only people. There's administration and enthusiasts or whatever. But I think that there doesn't have to be a conflict.
Yeah, let me ask you something. Dude, this just popped into my head. Let's say for a moment, we accept the premise that orchestras must be more diverse. Paint a picture for me. What does the end goal of this look like, to where you say, we've achieved, we've arrived at this place that we should be, orchestras are properly diverse? Is there a number in mind? Like, how do you know that you've achieved this goal, and what does that look like?
Another reason why I really like you is because of the end questions that you give. Like, what's your vision? Like what's a positive vision for the future look like? And I want to give an example of what I feel like would be a way to do all the things, or at least a start. The Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra went to Carnegie Hall a couple months ago and played Shostakovich 5. It was their 77th time playing the piece since it was written. And it's been 11 years since they went to Carnegie Hall, and there was a lot of pressure on them. I wasn't there. I stayed back. And that's fine, but I knew that it was a success. And that's like the end goal. And then it's like, okay, well, then now what? Then then we just move on to the next thing. But I kept thinking about, like, especially America, I feel like is built off of consumption, or just humanity in general loves to consume. And I think we need to start looking at things like that. Like, we think about, what do we put in our body and how does it physically come out into the world? A positive future vision for me that also I think will help clear up this conflict, is that an orchestra that plays Shostakovich 5 76 times has to embody the message of Shostakovich 5, which is that music is subjective. There are a lot of truths here, but Shostakovich 5, to me and a lot of other people, talks about what it was like for Stalin to do both things, to write the truth and good music and stay alive. And if we embody that, if we've played this 77 times, that must mean that the thing that I've consumed should be coming out. And if there are anybody in my community, whether that's Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago, whatever, if anybody feels this way, I have to do something at institution, player, whatever, have to make sure that that doesn't happen. And part of that is by playing the music and reminding everybody that this happened, but also we need to do it in real time and not just on stage.
Well,
And
I
I
want to
think
return.
when we do that, yeah, sorry.
I want to return to the question, though. What is a win in DEI for orchestras? It's a more specific question. For DEI in orchestras, what is the win in order for people to say, all right, the orchestras are properly diverse. We don't need to be implementing these programs anymore. We've achieved this success. What does that look like exactly?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't answer that question. I think that's, I think we're making a mistake by thinking that there will ever be a time where we've achieved heaven. You know what I mean? I don't think that there will ever be a time where we need to stop thinking about being more inclusive or more equitable to people. You know, and I think that might be also like an issue that people are having, is because some people don't want to. Humanity is like, doesn't want to let go of the good things. They don't want to change. I think a lot of that is rooted in, I want to be here instead of, what am I trying to say? I think we have to get away from that. I think we have to understand that there will never be a time when we're done doing the work.
I would be remiss if I didn't articulate what I'm sure the comment section is going to be throwing at me, and I'll try and articulate what I think the response to that would be. It seems to me that that's a continuously shifting goalpost. I agree. Obviously, on this side of glory, nothing will ever be perfect, and there will always be problems. Understandable. But if the goal of, let's say, a DEI program is to correct some sort of injustice, and the response is, well, it's an injustice that can never be corrected, that seems to me to be a sort of losing position from the start, with the goalpost that the closer you get to it, the further away it seems to retreat, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that I can definitely understand that. It's like, well, what's the point of doing this if you're telling me there is no end goal? Then why should I do this anyway? Maybe, kind of thing. And I think that if you're truly rooted in the, if I'm truly rooted in the mission of this music and understand that this music that is about me was written 300 years before I was here, I know that I will never see the reward in my lifetime. I just know that. I think that maybe is the conflict that I have, is like, why are you thinking about ending this? What you should be thinking, not you, what I believe that this hypothetical person, me, I don't want to say used to be, in many aspects I probably still act this way, but I'm not worried about the goal. All I'm worried about right now is helping anybody who needs help. And I think that is both the people that we're targeting with DEI policy, but also the people who are already there. It's not, and I think that might be in a conflict with DEI, is that DEI, I think the way that DEI is done makes it hard for everybody to suffer and to show their suffering and to be like, this is what has happened to me. And maybe this person who's asking that is probably thinking, well, when will I be able to suffer too? I think that if anyone thinks that there is an end, and this is why liberal policy is an issue, but like DEI, that diversity end goal, if you're thinking about that and being able to turn this off, that's the wrong way to think about it. And I think that if we're constantly thinking about that, about how I can end this, then the conflict will always continue.
There's another criticism of DEI that I'm going to try and articulate, and I want to get your thoughts to. And it is a leading question of, does DEI run both ways? And here's what I mean by that. Let's say that we are accepting the premise that orchestras, universities, administrations, music ensembles need to be more diverse. So let's accept that premise for a moment.
Yeah.
Jumping over to something like mariachi music, which is Mexican in its origin. And I bring this up partly because I grew up in Corpus Christi, and this is a very popular form of music. It's very far down south in Texas. You're going to hear it all the time. Mariachi ensembles are primarily made up of Mexicans or Tex-Mex or people who have Hispanic lineage. If I go over to jazz music is primarily a Black American genre. Not exclusively. I'm not saying that there aren't obviously white performers and white composers. That's true. But if you're going through the best jazz performers of the 20th century, you are going to find that most of them are Black Americans, and they're some of the most famous names that you've ever heard in America. If I go down to Colombia, which I was just there in December, most of the music there is going to be Colombian music and have Colombian ensembles. Now, if I am approaching these ensembles, these genres of music from a DEI perspective, I might notice that there is a tremendous lack of diversity within the ensembles. And I'm not just talking about white people, I'm talking about people who are not of those genres. So in jazz, I'm noticing, wow, there's a lot of Black musicians here. If it's mariachi, I'm noticing, wow, it's a lot of Mexican musicians here. If it's Colombian music, I'm noticing, wow, it's a lot of Colombians here. And yet nobody seems to have a problem that these ensembles, that these genres are not, at least technically, diverse. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that and see how DEI applies to, let's say, non-white institutions. Or I should say traditionally thought of as white, non-white institutions.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to deal with because it's like, yeah, like, how can you say this and then why isn't it everywhere and why isn't it going both ways? And I think I have to point to DEI and the way that we think about it is a liberal creation. This was something, a liberal policy that was created to put a Band-Aid over an issue. And I feel like because of that, the reason why DEI is something that only happens in certain spaces is because, let's say, like, the reason why DEI is something that's happening in orchestras in America and not mariachi bands is because the orchestra is a symbol of power, and it is consumed by people who have this power. And I think that's why there's a big magnifying glass on it. And I think that the liberal policy is something that creates this conflict and why we only pick certain things. Yeah, I guess I don't know how else to answer that question, because I feel like I would have the same energy for somebody who was upset that they can't, or at least be able to understand why they feel that way. I know that Mr. Zimmerman brought up the NBA and Black people and how the like, why isn't there he didn't say that, but I feel like that's what he was trying to get at. It was like, well, you don't see me complaining about NBA being made up of mostly white people. I don't care about that. I just want the Knicks to win, is what he said. Like, and I feel like that's a fundamental misunderstanding of why Black people have made up the NBA, and I think that it's partly because of my story with football, and why I got into football was because I saw football as a way to save me and my family, and it has been accepted for whoever I was to be there, and I think that the when something is seen as something that will save me, I want in, and I'm going to make it an issue that you won't let me in and let me save myself. If somebody feels that being in a mariachi band will save them, and they're white and they're not being let in, I think that we should engage with that and try to figure out as to why they're not being let in. I don't know. I understand it's just an example, but I I think, okay, everything that I'm trying to say with when it comes to how we don't understand the product, or like um, DEI policies don't allow everybody to suffer. I think that if we're going to do this DEI thing, we have to acknowledge white suffering. Period. I think we have to,
Can you
right?
define white suffering for people who are unfamiliar?
Uh, and this is not an academic term, but this is a term like this project. When I'm trying to humanize Wagner, I have to come to terms with how people were living in 18th century Germany, and a whole bunch of city states, all under. I mean, not all of the 18th century, but I'm thinking specifically like 1722, Well-Tempered Clavier, where he wrote that. Like, there's a whole bunch of fragmented city states that are all pretty much governed by the Holy Roman Empire in a feudal state. I can't imagine what it's like to live like that, and to eat dirt, and to work on this farm and be a farmer for this feudal lord, and to never get anything that I have created with my hands. And then to see that same group of people go all the way into, and I may be missing some steps, but I'm trying to look at this from a Baldwin view, from all the way up here, is that when we play this music, we need to talk about what has happened to white people when it comes to their, specifically German people. This is like a German romanticist institution, because we're talking about German composers. We need to come to terms with what has happened there too. It's not, DEI cannot just be about, okay, we need to let these people in who have suffered a great deal more recently, even though that's like the easiest way to go about this. I think that you're right. DEI should be going both ways. We should be implementing DEI not just from an employment standpoint and trying to make a more diverse staff or orchestra, but also how we engage with the product is how we need to be. We need to acknowledge that suffering of the people who are also in control at the same time, And I think that if people are allowed to suffer, if people are allowed to grieve, and for other people to understand that, then we can move from it. Because I feel like the conflict has a lot to do with people not being able to feel like that they can suffer along with the rest of us, And I think that this music is a perfect way to get to the root of that also. So I agree with you. I think that DEI should be going both ways, and I think that it's an issue It's a result of liberal policy, I think, is that it was created to solve a problem in which they didn't, and I don't really know who they is, but like just to superficially solve this problem. I hope that makes more sense and clears that up.
Yeah, the other angle I suppose we could approach this from, again, taking a step back and just trying to get an understanding of what it is that is happening. I know that one of the other criticisms that pops up is that this, let's say, again, let's accept the premise, lack of diversity in orchestras and jazz and mariachi and Colombian music and Tuvan Mongolian throat singing and pick your genre of music. This diversity or lack thereof is not necessarily a bad thing and is a result to not academic gatekeeping, but it's a result of cultural preferences. And as an example, if you are in the United States and you go and listen to a great orchestra, it's true. Most of the orchestra musicians on stage are going to be white, but they're not typically American white. They're usually Eastern European white, Russians and Ukrainians and Croatians and Hungarians, a lot of Slavs. Most of the people that I've interacted with in my music career have been from those areas. That's a tradition that I'm much more familiar with than, let's say, an American musical tradition. This is a result of culture putting out these types of musicians, these musicians coming over here to America, crushing it in a meritocratic blind audition. And as a result, this is how these things are formulated. The people who listen to classical music in the United States is already a very small number. And there's different statistics that people can go and look in and dive into, who's actually attending these concerts. Most of the people who attend these concerts are, I think the official term is non-Hispanic whites. I think the number is something like 85%, according to arts.gov. And then it's a very small minority of people who are attending these concerts. Not because people are keeping them from it, but because people just don't really care about it. I think the number of the people who listen to classical concerts, which is already a very small number, the percentage of those people who are non-white is something like 6%. It's a very small minority number. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because that's just a cultural preference. What would you say to somebody who had this criticism?
I think that is the criticism pretty much boiling down to, well, these people are just, do you think that criticism is people just being like, well, these people are just better at this thing? Do you think that that's what they mean?
I'm sure some people would say that. I'm sure some other people would say something like, well, it's just cultural interest. Like, I'll use myself as an example so it's less abstract. I did not grow up in a household that listened to a lot of rap. I listened to classical music growing up. We didn't have a lot of money. It wasn't a wealthy family by any stretch of the imagination, but this was the music that was pushed, and it was the music, I say pushed, this was the music that was preferred, and it's the music that I listened to. It's the music that I'm more familiar with. I have a preference to classical music, which is why I move in that direction. People who look like me, who come from that part of the culture, probably have a higher inclination towards classical music. They prefer this over, it doesn't even have to be rap, pick your genre of music. They prefer this type of music to that music. And if you come from a culture that prefers a certain type of music, then you're just going to be more inclined towards that. If these statistics are to be trusted, and I'm sure that they can be disputed, but if these statistics are to be trusted, that on average, Black Americans do not typically listen to classical music, that could have some influence as to why we don't see as many Black Americans in the orchestra. And I'm not saying whether I agree or disagree with that criticism. I'm just saying that is a criticism, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't even know if that's like criticism. I think that might just be the truth. I grew up, like I said, I'm biracial. My mom's white and my dad is Black, but I grew up with a Black stepfather and his family, and I never listened to classical music either. I grew up on the person that I think about, the musician I think about mostly in my childhood is Luther Vandross. I mean, like, feel like I'm chasing that sound in the orchestra all the time. Like, just because it's so foundational to my musical bias. And so I think that's true. I mean, like classical music, if I were to ask my stepdad's family back then what they think about classical music, and especially because of he would joke around and say like, "Oh, you're a nerd" or whatever when I would listen to classical music or something when I was playing my game on my computer at the same time. So like classical music, yeah, has been sort of rejected. Things can be rejected by cultures, and I think that happens because of what has happened to that culture wherever they end up. I just think that we live in a time now. Yes, I think that that's the truth, but I think the orchestra, classical music, has to change because of the world that we're living in and going into. And now we're going to go into politics, if that's okay.
I have tried so hard to not ever talk about politics on this podcast. Yeah. I'll engage with what I can, but I've gone out of my way to avoid making this a political podcast. It's an arts and humanities podcast. That's why I try and host people with all different backgrounds and perspectives. And
and I won't get too propaganda. I'm going to keep it as I'm going to try to keep it as factual as possible, just so I can try to tell you where I come from as a Black classical musician, is that I see this current administration putting its name on the Kennedy Center. I see that as a way to be like, this is mine. Shostakovich also dealt with that. I know that, and I don't mean to tie
Stalin to Trump.
Right. I'm not trying to tie those people. I'm just saying that it has been used, classical music, and this is why I'm like, okay, well, there needs to be some objectivity, because people who have affected other people's lives will use this as a tool. It will be a tool used for this powerful class to then enact or justify its actions onto a certain people, whether that action is good or bad. And I think, okay, this is perfect, because I think that the conflict that Mr. Zimmerman had with his Black oboe colleague was that when you're an aware Black person who is motivated by what has happened to your people, and you get into a place where you're one of the first. This is how I felt in Atlanta. I felt like I had to be a part of this mission. When I'm there and I've recognized that not to say that the same, but the power that put my people into a specific place, and I really don't just mean Black, I'm also Irish. What people in power, how they act, the culture around them, it's easy to look at classical music and be like, that's the same. And when I'm there, or when James Zimmerman's colleague is there, and why he gets so upset is because that player, that Black player, will sometimes feel like, I need to do the work from the inside, and people can be like, well, that's people can take that as like a negative ulterior motive, but I see that as an opportunity to help my people. I see that these people have power, and they like the music that I produce for them. How can I use that to help my people, not just my people, because I spoke about Black liberation being also the collective liberation. So what lesson do I take as a Black man, knowing that my ancestors were enslaved, is that I have to do everything in my power to make sure that nobody ever feels like that again. And when I go and when I'm in this space with these powerful people, I've never had a chance to talk with these people. I just know that they're there, right? Because I just play an instrument. That's also why I want to be in administration, is when you have something powerful that will help me, you cannot get upset with me for trying to be a part of it. And so when people say, well, like certain cultures, because the person who has that criticism of, well, cultures accept this and that, it's almost like, well, you don't want me here, is how it feels like, because you're trying to, not you, but trying to justify blah, 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 blah. I see this as a tool to help people. But, and I think that's, I think that may be the issue, especially when I think the Zimmerman case is something that's really on my mind, is that I know the person that, I never worked with him, but I know who that person is, and I know where they're coming from, and they're using this as a tool to help their people. I think that might, I don't know, does that play into what you're talking about? Like how, yeah, just tell me what you think about that, please.
Yeah, well, let me put a pin in that. I want to come back to something you said. Let's again go back to the statistic of, I think it's something like 6% of classical listeners, which is again already a very small minority of people, are Black Americans. Let's say that that's true for a moment, and I think you even said earlier that might be true, at least culturally speaking.
Sure.
If that's true, if the cultural preferences, we don't want anything to do with classical music, that isn't music that resonates with us, why is diversity then such a big deal? If it's a cultural preference, unless, and you correct me if I get this wrong, unless you're saying that the preference itself is wrong, why would you want to push for diversity if the cultural preference is just, that's not our thing?
Okay, I see what you mean. Right, as like, or like, who am I to say that this needs to change effectively, is what.
Right. If the culture, and again, I'm speaking in very general terms, if the culture you're
Of course.
coming from says, this isn't our thing, this isn't our music, and you have a culture that has gravitated towards classical music, in the same way that you would say mariachi music is primarily made up of Mexicans and Asians don't really prefer mariachi music, why would there need to be a campaign to get more Asians into mariachi music, or in this case, more Black Americans into classical music, if the cultural preference just isn't oriented in that direction?
Yeah. I mean, that's hard, because I feel like, I mean, of course it's hard. I feel like all these kind of questions are difficult ones to answer in like a way that is true. Um, Now that I'm here and I realize the importance, now that I understand what Maestro Ricardo Muti meant, that you need this. Here's my frou-frou dream. I have all the power to do whatever I want. All music is for everybody. And if somebody wants to be in that, well, yeah, no, this is difficult for me, because I'm thinking, because I don't know if necessarily the goal for me in this space right now is to primarily up that number from 6% to like, I can't remember the population of Black people in America, 13%, whatever it is. My goal isn't necessarily to then get as close to that 13% or that total population as possible. I don't know. I think that's something that will happen. That's the diversity thing that will happen after we do the things that we need to do. You know what I mean? So it's not necessarily about me wanting to get more Black people on stage or more Black people in seats, though I would love that. What I want is for the people that are already here to understand the things that have happened to them. So the stories that this music tells is something that also happened to these people. And if they can relate to that, then they should be a part of it. If an Asian person can relate to whatever the core principles of mariachi music is, which I mean, with all music is like there has to be some sort of suffering in that. You know what I mean? There must be some sort of blues in that. If anybody can relate to that in a healthy way, I think that's I don't know. I think it transcends culture, and we can't put music. I mean, even though this music comes out of a particular culture, particular music comes out of particular cultures. I think that we have to do our best in this global reality that we all live in, as we all have these and can see whatever's happening on the other side of the world. Is that we have to relate this to other people, and if we don't, we're gonna die. Is how I feel.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Obviously, I mean,
Yeah,
and it sounds like what you're advocating for, and I'm completely on board with this. Is a wider cultural outreach with great music, because great music
correct.
makes people better in general. It makes your culture healthy. It makes people
Right.
feel better. It makes people happier and more driven to do great, beautiful, transcendent things. I think that that's
Mhm.
great. I would be remiss though if I didn't point out that that's not a pro DEI argument.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, I think that and so that's why I also have issues with DEI and what it is and how we all have engaged with it. I think that DEI has not gone the way that it should be. You know, I feel like I definitely agree with that. You know, and I think that even though that's the case, it could be. You know, I don't care about DEI really. You know, I mean, like I love the idea, the way that it's been implemented. I don't necessarily love other than you know it's got people in the door that we have these the conversations are happening um but I think that I'd have to agree with but it has to happen. Yes, I agree with you, but it has to happen in a way where nobody is told no, you can't come in because if you come in the music won't be great.
Well, that would be true though if the person doesn't play well, correct?
Yeah, but is that the issue with that people have with DEI? I don't feel like that's the issue that people have with
No,
DEI.
and I don't want to speak on behalf of everybody. I think the issue people
Yeah,
have with DEI is that it does let people who play badly into the door. Not all the time. I'm not saying that
right.
exclusively, but it has a higher likelihood of letting somebody who doesn't play well in the door. And I will say personally, and I don't want to obviously name names, but I have seen that
Yeah,
happen many times, particularly working within a university. And I'm not just talking
yeah.
about Georgia State. I mean, like in the schools that I've attended, I have seen the behind the scenes of how that happens. And it does come through not official quotas, but like unofficial, like the dean comes to a teacher and says,
Yeah.
hey, I'm noticing that your studio isn't diverse. What's up with that? And that's a very non accusatory way of saying, hey, you need to be doing some recruiting that I don't think you're doing.
And you know, I would say that, and I would say that that's pretty. I think that that's a healthy way to go about this. It's like, hey, you know, you haven't hired any women. You know, what I mean, like, I think that that's something that we should all be aware of. Like, why are all these people all white? Because, and the reason why that's an issue, I think, is because there are people who are non-white who can also do the job well. And I also think that before DEI, when people got hired, people also failed when they got hired. You know what I mean? And I think that because that's a reality on top of okay, well, you have to hire a black person. When that happens, people will be like, oh well, it's because they hired a they didn't care about anything else and they just hired a black person. And I feel like that's maybe what Mr. Zimmerman is trying to was trying to say was like, you know, he's here just because he's black. That player, Titus Underwood, is one of the greatest players on earth at his instrument. Period. And he got through the audition. He's there and he's good. And you can what we can do is work with that or not work with that. We can be vengeful, we can not try to understand people, whatever. But I think that I don't. I'm sure that that's like you said. I think that you're telling the truth. I'm sure that there have been situations like that, but I'm not sure that that's like the issue with DEI. I think the issue with DEI is the other side of it, like the thing that we're saying, like it's not going both sides. You know what I mean? I have a hard time being like DEI is the reason why music is worse now and people don't like it.
Do you not think that people are afraid to criticize people who are non-white in their music because they'll be called racist or some sort of phobic? Or
Yep.
I've seen this happen in compositions. Like some of the bad classical compositions I've heard, some of the worst ones I've ever heard, weren't just
Yeah.
white students. And yet the teachers were afraid to call it out because the students would say something like, "Well, this is my background," or this is my story," and the teacher didn't have the courage to say, "That's fine, but the music itself sucks, and that's the only thing that I'm grading you on."
I think that that is that's something that I think about a lot. Actually, I mean, we at the PSO, what we do is we have 4 annual meetings, and we all get together and they talk budget or whatever they want to talk about. And we just had one, and it was on um, sexual harassment in hostile working environments, and it's based around the law, and it's really boring. And we have to all sit there and like go through it and be lectured to, which sucks. No matter whatever we're talking about, which is why I really respect you. It's really hard to be a teaching artist and lecture and teach somebody and also have them be entertained, whatever. And she made a joke when she was going through stuff, was like she was talking about characteristics that could be discriminated against, and if that's something that is discriminated against, then you have a case on your hands pretty much. And it was like sex, gender, race, nationality, religion, blah, blah, bam, bam, what you ate for this morning. You know what I mean? Like it's a whole bunch of different things. And I was thinking to myself, I was like, I feel like only a couple things will happen because of this. One way that is the issue with my issue with DEI and how we've done it is that when you put all of these rules on people and you make them afraid to talk, what happens is people won't say anything and there will be no growth. And so I saw that as something. I'm like, well, this seems like a recipe for disaster. I don't want anybody to be discriminated against for any of these things. But if somebody doesn't know, how does punishing them through the law ever help them understand the truth of the situation? Does that make sense? I think I relate a lot to that. Is like, not only DEI is to go the other way. I, as a black person, have to do a better job of understanding where a white person is coming from. I have to. And maybe I'm a little bit easier because I come from white family, and the people who raised me were white. All my football coaches, all of my teachers were all white. All of my bassoon teachers were all white. And this is what James Baldwin said too, was that the destiny, the racial destiny of, and I think it's bigger than just black and white, but in his context was that we're in this together, period. And we have to help each other. And so, absolutely, yes, I agree with you that it needs to be the other way around too.
Well, actually, to put my cards on the table, I'm not actually advocating that it needs to go both ways. I'm not saying, white people need some sort of special kid gloves or special treatment or anything like that.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
very much pro meritocracy, and I understand it was Daniel Markovits, the Yale, I think, law professor, who made the argument against meritocracy, saying that it's inherently unfair because meritocracy can't actually exist because people start with different backgrounds and different resources. And yeah, I agree with all that. I think the world is terribly unfair. I just don't know of a fairer way to judge somebody other than by their capabilities. It's true. I don't want people to judge me because, I'm a white professor at a university. I want them to judge me on the merit of the conversations and the performances and the writings. I want people to judge me on the things that I can do. I don't want to be judged on anything else, and I wouldn't want anybody else to be judged on whatever characteristics they have beyond their merit, and that inherently is going to be unequal, and I'm comfortable with that because that's just the way the world works. People are going to be discriminated against based on what it is they can and cannot do. If you get hired for a job, you were discriminated against other people who applied for that same job, and that's just the way of the world. I'm comfortable with that. I guess what I'm saying is that DEI runs against this concept of meritocracy, and that's why I'm not in favor of it.
Yeah, I feel like I can totally understand that. And I think that probably does happen where everything is a liberal policy is like quotas. I need to get a quota. You need to have this number. And however you need to get it, however you do it. And like, they're just like, hire people. I don't see that happening where it will go, like the person isn't good enough to get it. But I understand that I'm sure that has happened. And I believe you when you say that you experienced that. I just think I have a hard time disagreeing with you because the thing that I'm focused on is that the reason why we feel this way about DEI is because of the people who have implemented it. And it has been implemented in a way that people can use to say, well, this isn't meritocratic. I think, I think that's, sorry if I'm not engaging with what you're saying.
No. I only try and ask difficult questions.
Yeah,
it makes the concept makes the conversation much more interesting. And obviously, there's more to say on DEI. I'm very interested to see how it progresses. The Zimmerman case will be interesting. I will be curious as to the legal arguments that are made. I don't think DEI is going away anytime soon.
No.
And I'm not necessarily looking to change it at this point. I'm more interested in how can we work within the system and, make sure that there isn't too much unfair, unfair policies or agendas that are put in place. But I think we'll have to leave that with the audience for now. The last question that I've been asking everybody, and I've decided to keep it for this cycle because I think it's a good question. Podcasts are useless unless there's some practical information that people can take away and apply for themselves. Carlos, do you have any practical advice that people could take away from this conversation, or practical advice you'd like to leave people with?
I think the thing that I would like to leave people with is that music is special. I want people to really try and try and help other people without expecting anything back. And I would really love, and I think this goes back to what I was saying about like having a dream and having a goal you want and thinking that it's for you. I want people to think about how can this goal of mine, if people have a goal, I think that people can just live and, not have any goal. I don't care how you live, that's cool. But how can I help other people? How? And how can that be number one in my mind about who was not here, who was suffering, and how can I help them? And that's I'm not Jesus. I'm not trying to say that everybody, I'm the only one who's thinking this way, but the issues that I see come largely from people trying to survive on their own, thinking of their own survival. I think we need to think more about other people, and especially those people who we think want us dead. We have to be thinking about our perceived enemies as people too. And whatever you do in life, if we're all guided by that, I think we'll all be okay. And I think that's the most simple I can put that piece of practical advice for the audience.
Sure. Thank you again for coming on. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Maybe we'll do a part 2 at some point. Maybe we'll see what happens with the administration, and if any of these policies change, we can revisit this in a couple months and see what happens.
Maybe we should. I would also love to talk with you about maybe not as hot of a topic. I would love to talk about music. I would love that.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Well, thanks again, Carlos. I appreciate it.
Thanks, David.